Find your pulse. 2 fingers on the side of your neck, just below the jaw. Press gently against the windpipe. Feel the thumping under your fingertips. That is your carotid artery, and at this moment it is moving blood up into your brain at roughly 30 centimeters per second. Tonight, when you lie down to sleep, that same artery will spend somewhere between 7 and 9 hours in a position you choose. And over 20 years of those nights, the position you choose will either preserve that artery or age it by more than a decade. I want to tell you why. Behind your throat, paired left and right, 2 carotid arteries run upward from the aortic arch and disappear into the base of your skull. Once they cross into the cranium, they branch like the roots of a tree turned upside down. The middle cerebral artery, the anterior cerebral, the posterior communicating. Around each branch, wrapped close as a sleeve around an arm, runs a second channel. Not a vessel, not exactly. A space, a fluid-filled gap between the artery itself and the brain tissue it feeds. This space has a name, the perivascular space. Sometimes it is called the Virchow-Robin space, after the 2 anatomists who first described it in the 1850s. For more than 100 years after they described it, nobody knew what it did. We know now. It is a plumbing system. It is how the brain takes out the trash. Every cell in your body produces metabolic waste, spent proteins, broken enzymes, fragments of the molecules that powered the last hour of thinking. In every other organ of the body, the lymphatic system carries that waste away in slow channels of clear fluid. The brain has no lymphatic vessels. For most of medical history, anatomists looked for them and could not find them, and they concluded that the brain simply did not produce much waste. They were wrong. The brain produces enormous amounts of waste. It is the hungriest organ in the body, 20% of your oxygen consumption and roughly 20% of your glucose, packed into something that weighs 3 pounds. It must clear that waste every single night, or the protein fragments accumulate, and the brain begins to fail. The most notorious of those fragments is called amyloid beta. The accumulation of amyloid beta is the lesion that defines Alzheimer's disease. So how does the brain clear its waste without a lymphatic system? For decades, nobody could answer that question. Then a Danish neuroscientist named Nedergaard, working at the University of Rochester in New York, found the answer. The clearing happens through those perivascular spaces. Cerebrospinal fluid is pushed into the sleeve around each cerebral artery. It flows through the brain tissue. It picks up the waste. And it drains out along the veins. The whole system pulses with the heartbeat itself. Every contraction of the artery acts like a piston, pushing fluid through the surrounding sleeve. Nedergaard gave the system a name, the glymphatic system. Glymphatic, because it functions like the lymphatic system, but uses the brain's glial cells to do the work. That is the geography. You have a brain wrapped in arteries. Around each artery, a drainage channel. And the drainage channel only opens during sleep. Now stay with me. This is where the architecture starts to matter. Here is the first thing you need to understand. The glymphatic system is not running right now, not while you read this. During waking hours, the perivascular spaces are roughly 60% smaller than they will be tonight. Cerebrospinal fluid moves through them at perhaps a third of its nighttime flow. The janitor is off the clock. In 2013, a researcher named Lulu Shi, working in Nedergaard's laboratory, published a paper in the journal Science that I think is one of the most beautiful experimental papers of the last 20 years. She trained mice to sleep under a microscope, not anesthetized, actually sleeping. She injected a fluorescent tracer into their cerebrospinal fluid and watched in real time where the tracer went. During wakefulness, the tracer barely moved into the brain tissue. The moment the mice fell asleep, the tracer flooded inward. The glial cells had shrunk. The perivascular spaces had opened. Waste clearance accelerated by something close to a factor of 2. Sleep, in other words, is when the janitor arrives. The whole architecture of the brain reconfigures at night to flush itself. She's paper raised a question that her colleague at Stony Brook University would answer 2 years later. Helene Benveniste, a Danish-born neuroscientist now at Yale, asked a different question. Not when does the glymphatic system run, but in what position does it run best? She put rats to sleep in 3 positions: supine, on their backs; prone, on their bellies; lateral, on their sides. She measured, using fluorescent tracers and magnetic resonance imaging, the rate at which cerebrospinal fluid moved through their perivascular spaces in each position. The paper was published in the Journal of Neuroscience in August of 2015. The lateral position. Side sleeping. Cleared waste roughly 60% more efficiently than the supine position. The brain on its side drained itself better than the brain on its back. The prone position fell in between, slower than lateral but somewhat faster than supine. 60%. That is not a small effect. That is the difference between a kitchen sink that drains and a kitchen sink that does not. The mechanism, as far as anyone can tell, has to do with the geometry of the venous outflow. When the head is rotated to one side, the jugular vein on the dependent side compresses partially while the other opens wider. The cerebrospinal fluid finds its preferred drainage path. The arteries pulse against tissue arranged in a way that pumps fluid forward rather than letting it stagnate. The architecture of the human head, it turns out, is built to be slept on its side. That is the first mechanism. That is the brain. And while the brain drains, the artery feeding it is being subjected to a second physical event that the same position controls. Lie flat on your back. The soft palate at the roof of your mouth, the tongue at the floor of it, both have weight. In a young person with strong muscle tone, that weight is irrelevant. The pharyngeal muscles hold the airway open through the night without any conscious effort. In a person past 50, that changes. The muscle tone of the throat declines. The soft tissue redistributes. Fat accumulates around the neck, even in people who have not gained much weight elsewhere. The diameter of the upper airway narrows, and gravity, which never sleeps, begins to pull the soft tissues backward whenever the person lies on their back. In some people, the airway holds anyway. In others, it narrows enough to make the breathing turbulent. That is snoring. And in roughly 30% of adults past 50, the airway collapses entirely for 10 seconds, sometimes 30 seconds, sometimes longer. The chest continues to try to draw breath. No air comes in. The blood oxygen drops. The brain registers asphyxia. The sympathetic nervous system fires. The sleeper gasps. The cycle begins again. That is an obstructive apnea event. And here is the part that nobody outside sleep medicine knows. In roughly half of all people who have obstructive sleep apnea, the events happen overwhelmingly in one position, supine, on the back. Avi Oksenberg, a sleep researcher at the Lowenstein Hospital in Israel, has spent his career documenting positional sleep apnea. His finding has been replicated in laboratories from Boston to Sydney. For roughly half of all sleep apnea sufferers, the apnea-hypopnea index, the number of breathing interruptions per hour, the standard measure of disease severity, drops by more than half when they sleep on their side instead of their back. For a substantial subset of those patients, side sleeping eliminates the disease entirely. They are not patients with sleep apnea. They are patients with supine sleep apnea. The diagnosis depends on which way they happen to be facing. And here is the next thing. Most of these patients do not know. The character we are talking about is real. A man in his 60s. He sleeps 8 hours a night by the clock. He wakes up tired. He attributes it to age. He snores loudly, his wife tells him, particularly when he sleeps on his back. He has never been to a sleep laboratory. He does not own a continuous positive airway pressure machine. His primary care physician has measured his blood pressure, found it slightly elevated, written a prescription, and moved on. Inside that man's neck, the carotid artery you found a moment ago runs directly past the tissues that collapse every 20 seconds when he sleeps supine. The artery is not collapsing. The airway above it is. But the consequences of that collapse propagate down into the artery in a way I will tell you about in a moment. The artery does not care that he does not have a diagnosis. The artery responds to physics. The physics is the same whether or not anybody has written a name for it on a chart. The consequences happen one heartbeat at a time, and the damage is in the accumulation. When the airway closes and oxygen stops entering the bloodstream, two small structures sitting directly on the carotid arteries themselves detect the change first. They are called the carotid bodies. Each one is the size of a grain of rice. They have the highest blood flow per gram of any tissue in the body, even higher than the brain itself, because their job is to monitor oxygen and carbon dioxide in the blood at the very moment it is heading upward into the head. The carotid bodies detect the drop in oxygen. They send a signal up the glossopharyngeal nerve into the brainstem. The brainstem responds in milliseconds. The sympathetic nervous system, the body's emergency system, fires across half the organs of the body simultaneously. Blood pressure surges. Heart rate climbs. Cortisol rises. The arteries themselves clamp down, constricting under the influence of norepinephrine flooding their muscular walls. The pupils dilate. The liver dumps glucose into the blood. The body prepares to fight or run. Then the sleeper gasps. Oxygen returns. The pressure relaxes. 40 seconds later, the airway closes again, and the cycle repeats. Now think about the arithmetic. In a person with moderate sleep apnea, this cycle repeats 15 to 30 times per hour. Across an 8-hour night, that is between 120 and 240 surges of blood pressure. Across a year of nights, more than 60,000. Across 20 years, more than 1 million. 1 million pressure surges, 1 million bursts of norepinephrine, 1 million cycles of oxidative stress as the tissues are repeatedly deprived of oxygen and then reflooded with it. Now I want to tell you about the layer of cells that is forced to absorb every one of these events. The lining of every artery in your body is a single layer of cells called the endothelium. It is 1 cell thick. You could lay all the endothelium in an adult human flat, and it would cover about half a tennis court, but it is only ever as thick as a soap film, and it is the most pharmacologically active tissue you possess. The endothelium manufactures nitric oxide, a tiny molecule, 2 atoms. It diffuses into the smooth muscle of the artery wall and tells the muscle to relax. Without endothelial nitric oxide, the artery cannot dilate. Blood flow stagnates. Tissues downstream are starved. The endothelium also controls inflammation. It decides whether circulating white blood cells will stick to the wall and migrate through it or pass on by. It controls clotting. At every micrometer of arterial surface, it decides whether a platelet that contacts it will stick or slide off. And the endothelium is exquisitely sensitive to 2 things: oxidative stress from repeated hypoxia and mechanical stress from repeated pressure surges. 1 million pressure surges. 1 million failures of nitric oxide production. The endothelium slowly dies and is replaced. Not by more endothelium, by stiffer, less responsive tissue. Collagen accumulates in the artery wall. Elastin, the protein that gives a healthy artery its springiness, breaks down. The artery loses its capacity to expand and recoil with each heartbeat. It becomes a rigid pipe instead of a flexible one. Byron Summers, working at the Mayo Clinic, has spent more than 30 years documenting this cascade. His team has measured the sympathetic nerve activity of sleep apnea patients directly, with microelectrodes inserted into the peroneal nerve in the leg. They have watched the surges happen in real time. They have published in Circulation, in the New England Journal of Medicine, in Hypertension. The pattern is consistent across thousands of patients. Chronic sympathetic activation drives endothelial dysfunction. Endothelial dysfunction drives arterial stiffening. Arterial stiffening drives early cardiovascular death. And the trigger for half of these patients is body position. There is a number cardiologists use to measure how far this damage has progressed, and the number is what I would like to show you next. The number is called pulse wave velocity. It measures the age of an artery, not the age of the person who owns the age of the artery itself. Here is how it works. Every time your heart contracts, the aorta receives a slug of blood, and a pressure wave radiates outward from the ejection. That wave travels down the aorta and into the arteries of the legs and arms. It can be measured non-invasively at the femoral artery in the groin and the carotid artery in the neck. The speed at which the wave moves is determined almost entirely by the stiffness of the artery wall. In a young, healthy adult of 20, the wave moves at roughly 5 to 6 meters per second. The aorta is elastic. It absorbs the wave, expands with it, releases it slowly. In an older or diseased adult, the artery is stiff. It transmits the wave faster, 8 meters per second, 9, sometimes 10. Stéphane Laurent and Pierre Boutiri, working at the Hôpital Européen Georges Pompidou in Paris, established the reference values that cardiologists now use worldwide. They published a consensus document in the European Heart Journal that defines what pulse wave velocity should be at any given age. The line is approximately straight. Pulse wave velocity rises by roughly 1/10 of a meter per second for every year of healthy aging. Studies of untreated obstructive sleep apnea patients consistently find pulse wave velocity elevated by 1 to 1.5 meters per second above age-matched controls. The studies have been done in Brazil, in the United States, in Greece, in China. The numbers converge. Sleep apnea adds the equivalent of 10 to 15 years of aging to the aorta. 11 years is right in the middle of that range, sometimes more. Now picture the man I described to you a few minutes ago, the man who sleeps 8 hours a night and wakes up tired. He walks into his cardiologist's office at the age of 60. The cardiologist runs a pulse wave velocity measurement. The number comes back at 9 meters per second. The cardiologist looks at the chart and says, "Your arteries have the stiffness of a 71-year-old. The patient says, "I have always thought of myself as healthy." The cardiologist nods and writes another prescription. What neither of them is talking about, because nobody has measured it, is that the man sleeps on his back every night for the last 40 years. The 11 years live inside the position. I want to pause here and tell you what we know and what we are still working out, because everything I have said so far is true, but not every link in this chain is anchored to the same kind of evidence. I do not want to oversell anything. Let me grade what I have told you. The strongest finding, the one that sits on bedrock, is the connection between obstructive sleep apnea and arterial stiffness. That has been measured directly in dozens of laboratories on 5 continents. It is replicated. It is mechanism consistent. It has been demonstrated in interventional trials where treating the apnea reverses some of the stiffening. That is as close to settled science as cardiology gets. The second strongest is positional sleep apnea. The finding that the supine position dramatically worsens apnea in roughly half of sufferers. This has been measured directly in sleep laboratories using polysomnography, which is the gold standard. The patient lies on their back. The events double. They turn on their side. The events halve. The phenomenon has been replicated in every major sleep medicine center that has looked for it. A little less certain, but still strong, is the question of whether positional therapy alone, sleeping on the side without any other intervention, reverses arterial stiffening over years. The trials that have looked at this show benefit. The follow-up periods are shorter than I would like. The number of patients studied is in the hundreds, not the thousands. The mechanism predicts the result should be positive. The trials so far agree. I would tell you the case is strong rather than closed. Less certain again is the glymphatic finding. That lateral position drains the brain better than supine. This has been measured beautifully in rodents. In humans, the equivalent measurement is technically very difficult. Magnetic resonance imaging of cerebrospinal fluid flow in different positions has begun to confirm the rodent work. But the human data is younger than the rodent data, and I want you to know that. I think the rodent finding will hold up in humans. I do not yet have the proof in my hand. And least certain of all, but worth saying, the long-term compounding hypothesis. The idea that the same position protects the artery and the brain across decades, and that the cumulative effect on dementia risk and cardiovascular risk is meaningful and additive. This is what the physiology predicts. It is not what any single study has yet measured directly, because nobody has followed a cohort of side sleepers and back sleepers for 40 years with the right instruments. So when I tell you that sleeping on your back ages your arteries, that claim sits on bedrock. When I tell you that side sleeping protects your brain, that claim sits on something closer to packed sand. When I tell you the two effects compound over a lifetime, that claim is reasoned conjecture from a mechanism that should produce it. 3 layers of evidence. The first one is the one to act on. The other 2 come along for free. Now I want to tell you what the medical system has built around this problem. The standard treatment for moderate to severe obstructive sleep apnea is a machine called a continuous positive airway pressure device. The acronym is CPAP. The machine pushes air into the airway through a mask worn over the nose, sometimes over the nose and mouth, at a pressure high enough to splint the soft tissues open. The pressure prevents the collapse. The apnea events disappear. The sympathetic surges disappear. The endothelium recovers, at least partially. A CPAP machine in the United States costs between $800 and $3,000. The mask must be replaced every few months. The filters and the tubing every few weeks. Most patients pay several $100s a year in ongoing supplies after the initial purchase. Across 10 years, the total cost runs into the low thousands, much of it out of pocket even with insurance. CPAP works. It works very well. For the half of sleep apnea patients whose disease is severe or whose apnea persists regardless of position, the machine is the right answer. It saves lives. I do not want anyone listening to me to abandon a prescribed CPAP on the basis of what I am telling you. The machine is real medicine. But here is the part I do want you to understand. The molecular mechanism by which CPAP protects your arteries is the same molecular mechanism by which side sleeping protects them in patients whose apnea is positional. Both interventions prevent the airway from collapsing. Both prevent the carotid body from detecting hypoxia. Both prevent the sympathetic surge. Both spare the endothelium. The pathway is identical. The 2 interventions differ only in the size of the dose. CPAP delivers a strong, certain dose to every patient regardless of position. Side sleeping delivers a partial dose. The partial dose is small in patients whose apnea is not positional. It is large in patients whose apnea is positional. It is essentially complete in patients whose apnea would not occur at all on their side. For the patient with severe non-positional apnea, the dose difference matters enormously, and the machine is the answer. For the patient with mild positional apnea, the dose difference matters less, and the side of the body may carry most of the load. And for the patient who has never been diagnosed at all, who simply snores, who wakes up tired, who has never been studied in a laboratory, the side position may be protecting an arterial system that no machine was ever going to be sold to. The pharmacy down the road sells statins to slow arterial stiffening. The cardiology office sells antihypertensives to manage the blood pressure surges that are themselves the consequence of the apnea. The sleep clinic sells the machine. The position is free. The position has no salesman. The position will not be advertised on television because nobody is going to make money on it. I would not want you to skip the machine if your doctor has prescribed it. I would want you to know that the molecular signature of the relief the machine provides is also present, in a smaller and less certain dose, in the simple act of rolling onto your side. The body does not know the difference between the dose it received from the device and the dose it received from the position. The endothelium does not read the label, it reads the physics. My grandmother, and probably yours, said, "Do not sleep on your back." She said it the way she said, "Do not go outside with wet hair," with the same confident finality of a person who did not know exactly why she was right, but had watched enough sleeping bodies over enough decades to know that she was. In the older medical traditions, the Ayurvedic texts of India, the Greco-Arabic physicians of the medieval period, the village doctors of every culture who watched patients sleep in their own homes, the recommendation to sleep on the side, often specifically the right side, appears repeatedly across thousands of years and across cultures that had no contact with one another. The reasons they gave were always wrong. They spoke of the position of the heart. They spoke of the flow of humors. They spoke of the balance of the body's elements. They did not know about the carotid body. They did not know about the perivascular spaces. They could not measure pulse wave velocity. They had no language for endothelial nitric oxide, but they had eyes. And they had seen, across hundreds of patients and thousands of nights, that the side sleepers aged differently from the back sleepers. Their faces aged differently. Their breathing was quieter. Their hearts seemed to hold up. The villages, without instruments, noticed what the cardiology trials of the 1990s would later confirm. They were right for reasons they could not yet explain. The reasons turn out to be carotid bodies and perivascular spaces, and an endothelium 1 cell thick. The grandmother was a physiologist. She just did not have the instruments. The Ayurvedic physician was a sleep cardiologist. He just had to wait 2,000 years for the magnetic resonance imaging. And here is what I find most touching about all of this. The science did not contradict the folk wisdom. The science confirmed it. The mechanism was the missing piece, not the wisdom. The grandmothers had the conclusion. They just could not draw the diagram. Tonight, find your pulse one more time. 2 fingers, side of the neck, that same carotid you found at the beginning. Now lie down. Turn onto your side. Either side works for the apnea. The right side may work slightly better for the brain. Pull a pillow against your back so you do not roll over in the middle of the night. Some people sew a tennis ball into the back of their pajama top. That works too. The principle is the same. Make the supine position uncomfortable enough that the body refuses it. That is the entire intervention. The artery you just felt will spend the next 8 hours in a position that does not slowly age it. Across the next 20 years of nights, that adds up to more than a decade of vascular aging avoided. I would like to know which side you intend to choose tonight, and why.